go worse. To top it off, my boss, the company president, called me into his office to chastise me over a mistake made by someone else. The whole week at work had been terrible. When I got home, I found that my sister-in-law's car was blocking my driveway, so I couldn't park close to my house. I had to park 3 doors down as the teenage son of a neighbor and his buddies had parked automobiles all over the street. Coming inside the house, I wondered why I bothered. From the day we met, my relationship with Susan, my wife's sister, had always been tense. Though I couldn't understand why, she seemed to despise me right away. Moreover, despite my continuous attempts, we hadn't been intimate in about a month, thus I had little expectation for a special evening with my wife Janice. When I got to my driveway, I saw an empty garbage can by the curb and hauled it around the side of the house via the side gate to position near the back door. When I walked into the kitchen, my wife and her sister were chatting in the living room and I heard music. Pulling a beer from the refrigerator, I tasted it and turned to face the living room. But a sentence I overheard at the door stopped me cold. Not from my sister-in-law but from my darling wife. God, he ******ed me 3 times today. My wife admitted, ever since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of him. Brandon was my wife's ex-boyfriend, who had left her and gone away. Interested, the sister of my wife inquired, "So what are you going to do now?" Janice said, "I'll find a lawyer and file for divorce. Brandon wants me to move in with him. I'll get half of everything since this is a communal property state." More than enough had I heard. I went to the rear door numbly, then turned around to find my car. I opened the door and dropped into the driver's seat, now understanding the reason I had been denied any closeness. My wife wanted half of everything now since she was sharing it with someone else. The worst aspect was that she most certainly would get it from the state. Janice and I had tied the knot 3 years ago. She had left her employment immediately following our vows and never raised a finger at home. 3 times a week for house cleaning and laundry, I paid a maid. On those days, she would make dinner. She ordered takeout or I cooked the remainder of the time. Though love wore blinders on me, I know what you could be thinking. At least until a month ago she kept me pleased by giving decent sex. When my mother died when I was 13, my father and I suffered a terrible loss. We were really close and Dad did his best to raise me appropriately. Losing him to a drunk driver when I was 23 was a major blow, happening just 1 year before I saw Janice. Taking almost $2.5 million from Dad, I carefully managed the money under the direction of a competent broker. I had several $100,000 in savings that I had never touched, let them flourish even in the current economy, even as Janice tried to spend every dollar I made. I had enough to live reasonably without squandering my fortune. Our love for Janice caused us to overlook a prenuptial agreement, a common error many make believing their marriage will endure a lifetime. This control allowed her to perhaps take almost $1.5 million from me, all for the benefit of spreading her legs. The state looked all too ready to back this approved kind of exploitation. She had indicated she wasn't quite ready to serve me, so I realized I had some time to act and proposed contacting a lawyer. Developing a strategy, I watched the rear-view mirror in my car until I saw my sister-in-law's automobile pull out and head away. Starting the car, I turned around and headed back to my driveway. Janice vanished from sight when she first arrived at the house, so I went to get another beer in the kitchen. Popping the cap and sipping slowly, I considered where to go from here. Janice said, "Oh, there you are, honey," walking into the kitchen. "I didn't hear you arrive." "Hello, darling, I arrived right now." "Been a hard day," I said with a kind smile, resolved to perform as convincingly as she had. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she remarked, slightly pouting. Though I wanted to add, "That's because you spent your day with your lover, discussing all the details with your sister." What I said was, "That's okay, sweetheart. I'll just reheat some yesterday night's leftovers." She declared she was going to go up and relax in a hot bath, smiled sweetly, and kissed my cheek. Grinning and nodding, I thought, yeah, gotta wash all that away. She went and I ate a chilly plate of fried rice while downing 2 more beers. I threw the empty container, then channel surfed back to the den and sank into the chair. At last I came across an old movie. About half an hour later, Janice came back and sat on the couch till the movie stopped. Rising, she claimed to be exhausted and headed for bed. Yeah, worn out from being disloyal. I said I would join her later and watch the news. I hadn't actually seen the film. My thoughts were on strategizing my next action. Knowing I had little till Monday, I made it through the following few days working in the yard on Saturday and golfing on Sunday with friends. I handled my inherited holdings over Monday's call to my broker, and got everything sold. Being in top management let me quickly cash in my $401K, thus avoiding penalties. By Thursday I was ready to act. I told my apparently loving wife of an emergency and said that I would be heading out for a week on corporate business. All I needed was 2 suitcases packed. I had kept all that meant to me when we moved into this house. Nothing else I wanted fit her taste, so there was nothing else I wanted. She chose the furniture, hence honestly I couldn't give a damn about it. The silver lining in this was that we were renting the house, hence I had no financial commitment connected with it. We were looking for the perfect house to buy after just selling my unit. When I say right, I mean right as judged by her criteria. None of the homes we looked at seemed to fit her standards. I carried my bags out the door Friday morning and gave one more kiss on the cheek to my wife, load them into my Lexus, and I left without looking back once. My first stop was at the house of an old friend I trusted entirely. When I suggested a trading title for his repaired 4-wheel drive car, he was shocked. Having told him about my circumstances, an hour later I was traveling west. I questioned whether anyone would link me to this car, and Jake assured me the car I traded him for would be kept under cover in the garage for some time. I paid with cash for the next 4 days for everything. To try to leave no paper trace, I had canceled all of our credit cards. Thanks to my broker, most of my money was securely buried in an offshore account. I set up with him a mechanism to handle fund transfers as needed. There was enough cash stashed in the SUV to last for some time. The toughest were the evenings spent in motels. I had been too preoccupied last week implementing my strategy to consider what had personally happened to me. I had adored Janice. Had I not, I would not have married her. Though I experimented in my imagination through several what-if scenarios, I came to the conclusion that there wasn't much I could have done differently. I doubted I could have kept them apart even if I knew her former boyfriend had returned. Arriving at 2 conclusions, I realized it was my own fault for being naive enough to marry her, and she most likely never really loved me. On the 7th day away from home, I was seated at a tiny town Montana mom and pop cafe. By now my purportedly loving wife must have realized that our bank account was empty and that all of her credit cards were canceled. I wondered what she was up to. An older couple seated at the adjacent table caught my attention and broke off my thoughts with their subdued talk. Looking to be in his late 50s, the man was sharing with his red-haired wife his need for an additional worker on their farm. Sadly, they could not afford to pay someone until their present calves were ready for sale. Finding someone prepared to labor for what they could pay proved difficult even then. As I finished my last mouthful of food, I got up and went over to their table to apologize for listening in but also offer to help them. The elder man examined me closely, assessing me. "I don't understand how you could accomplish it. You know I can't pay you anything if you overheard what we were discussing. What if I merely need somewhere to live in return for my work?" I proposed. His eyes contracted. "Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I speak to this young man outside," he told his spouse. Rising, he watched for me to trail him. He turned to face me once in the parking lot, where our chat would stay private. I judged him to be roughly my height, 6 feet, with broad shoulders and no fat at all. His face revealed the rough lines of years spent laboring outside, and his once black hair was mostly gray. "Who the hell are you? Are you part of the Wilson Ranch?" he inquired, a little wary. Defensively raising my hands I said, "Hold on there, mister. About any Wilson, I know nothing. I arrived here this morning. 4 days ago I was living in Texas. Perhaps we could help one another out." He said, "Why would you want to assist us out if what you claim is true? I'm not able to pay you. What is it for you? We don't need such trouble if you're on the run from the law." Saying, "I'm probably on the run, as you put it, but not like you may think." I then told them about my unfaithful wife wanting to take me to the cleaners and how I could use a place to stay for a little. "Nobody have I robbed or killed. I'm just attempting to retain what is rightly mine. Should you have a place I could stay, I will work for you in return. I'll pay my own way. If you don't believe I'm of assistance, let me know. I'll be on my way with no resentment." Examining my face, he continued, "I think I would be a fool not to at least give you a shot if what you're telling me is the truth. I must tell you straightforwardly though, the Wilsons are trying to have me sell my land to them. Though I wouldn't write it past them, they haven't done anything dishonest yet. You might be chewing off more than you can handle." I told him I was ready to run the risk. He then asked about my experience ranching, and I told him straightforwardly, I was not a cowboy. I had spent a couple summers on my uncle's Texas property. He reached out and we shook in unison on our agreement. I introduced myself and he advised me to phone Bill, his first name. Colleen was waiting in the diner when we returned. He yelled out to her, "Colleen, this is Carson. Should he be able, he will be working for us." She got up and reached out her hand. I shook it and she said kindly, "It's very nice to meet you, Carson." Her voice was clear, maybe with a trace of Irish accent. She was trim and fit, just as her husband was. "It's good to meet you too, ma'am," I added. She answered, "You just call me Colleen, the last name is Buckman. Not really needed for formality in this region of the nation." This lovely woman appealed to me right away. Bill urged us to return to the ranch. He drove up to a general store before leaving town, and we both got out of our cars. "I might want to pick up some clothes fit for ranch work," he remarked. He was greeted warmly by the proprietor as he entered the store, clearly a frequent visitor. For the time being, a coat and some Western-style riding boots would have been plenty. From the general store, the main gate was about 20 minutes drive away, arched under the name Rocking Bee Ranch. Bill called his brand Rocking Bee. Another mile of a private road brought one to the main house on top of a hill. Their two-story house looked recently painted and well-kept. Behind it started to show a barn and a number of outhouses. The partially laden sacks of food in their pickup suggested their weekly supply excursion into town. I trailed the Buckmans into the kitchen, tugged behind them and packed things into my arms. 2 visits saw the vehicle emptied. Bill told me to drive out back and showed me a little hut for my lodging. I saw him standing in front of the cabin as I pulled around. He pointed to the cabin when I came out, saying Sam used a similar one a few yards away and mentioning Sam was out making the rounds. I will meet him later. He waited while I settled into the cabin after emptying my baggage. Its one big room featured a bed along one wall, a table with 2 seats, a potbelly wood burner in one corner, and a bathroom with a single stone shower. Though it wasn't opulent, it was tidy and a good place to stay for now. At least would let me hopefully avoid running across Janice. He was sitting in his pickup when I came outside and instructed me to climb in. With a couple of 100 acres put aside for winter fodder, he showed me around the roughly 6,000 acre property. Accessible solely on horseback, the mountainous, forest-covered back part of the ranch produced mountains with a creek running across the land. Bill said he used to have 3 full-time hands, but Sam was the only one left through trying circumstances. Sam had been working on the ranch almost 30 years ago. They recruited extra personnel during roundups choosing cattle to bring to market. Bill dropped me up at the modest cabin and said, "By the way, I saw you have a laptop. You can access the internet wirelessly from my satellite connection to a router. Supper is in the main house. We usually eat about 6:30. He left in tow. I was settled in less than 30 minutes, allowing time to turn on my computer. I made a Wi-Fi connection as he had advised and rapidly checked for emails. Jake sent one note that Janice had reported me missing to the police and they were looking at my absence. It provoked some thought for me. The only person I had really mentioned leaving was Jake, and even he was unsure of my destination. Though I had sent my resignation to my previous company, I hadn't personally told them about my leaving. I knocked on the main home door just before 6:30. Bill asked me to come in, and as I entered, Colleen was cooking while Bill stood to the side chatting to a man I thought to be Sam. Pointing me over, Bill said, "Sam, here is Carson, the new hand I mentioned. For today at least. After a day's work, we'll see how he feels about it tomorrow," Bill replied, flashing a broad smile. "Carson, meet Sam," said. Sam extended his hand and grinned warmly at me. At least 6 3/8 he was a large man. Like Bill, he seemed to have worked hard all of his life and matched in age. He was African American, one obvious fact. Sensing the force in his hand, I shook it. "Well, young man, let us hope this here appeals to you. I could benefit from your support," he replied. He thought of me as youthful since at 28 I was roughly half his age. I said, "I plan to give it my best shot." Colleen contacted us just then to get us seated for dinner. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and me to sit between them across from each other. On the table were a big dish of mashed potatoes, a huge platter of pork chops, another with fresh green beans, and a plate piled with definitely handcrafted biscuits. "We don't eat fancy here, Carson, but there's plenty and it's filling," Colleen stated. "It looks really good," I said. I asked Bill if he had lived here all his life as we ate. "Yep," he answered. "Starting this ranch, my grandfather handed it to my father. Now it belongs to Colleen and myself. Although, in younger years I wasn't so sure she would be involved with it. I had to fend off every man to acquire her." He turned to face his wife, and I could see how deeply he loved her. "Now Bill," she said, "you know you're the only man I ever had eyes for. I simply had to make sure you wanted me enough." Bill added, "My wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life: the day she agreed to marry me, the day she did marry me, and the day she gave birth to our daughter, Caitlin." Colleen must have seen my inquisitive expression and remarked, "Our daughter is away right now." I hadn't seen any indication of a daughter. She is at South Dakota State University completing her veterinary sciences PhD degree. She has only spent the holidays at home. We are eagerly waiting for her to return carrying her degree. She's supposed to be home in a couple of months, Bill said. Having a vet in the family will be great, and should help to reduce some of the costs. I tried to help clean the dishes after supper, but Colleen shooed me away saying it was her job. Breakfast at 5:30, Bill said, and work would start at 6 o'clock. I saw a copy of today's New York Times on the counter as Sam and I were leaving, perhaps picked up by Bill in town. He approved when I asked whether I might borrow the front page. I requested him to briefly step into my cabin once outside. Inside I pulled out my digital camera and taught him how to operate it. I had him snap a close-up of me displaying the newspaper's front page. Though he never asked, I could see he was fascinated. He did ask about an alarm clock. I told him I had one. Saying he would see me in the morning, he went. I downloaded the image to my computer and wrote an email including a note to the police in my former hometown. The message said I had left town of my own free choice and I was alive and healthy. Selecting a national newspaper over a local one left my whereabouts vague. I emailed Jake asking him to utilize one of the nearby coffee shops with free internet access. My work email was probably still operational, hence I gave my password so he could transmit the original email and picture to the police without leaving any traceable roads. Assuming the police wouldn't commit significant resources to hunt a fugitive husband, this manner I planned to avoid appearing on any FBI or national missing person databases. That night I fell asleep peacefully. I got up at 5 the next morning, showered, and got dressed in time to walk to the main house with Sam. Bill told Sam to get me going installing fence posts in the hillside part after lunch. He pointed out a horse and saddle I would require following Sam to the barn. Drawing on his experience on his uncle's property, he appeared happy with the way I saddled the huge brown horse. We then selected 2 mules and attached saddle packs using a post hole digger to load fence posts. Bill joined us in the barn carrying a saddle scabbard and a Winchester Model 94. He explained it was mostly for the odd occasion when we might have to call down a sick cow. Sam and I mounted up and set off following the creek up into the hills, each leading a mule. Sam and I developed a rapport and had talks while we rode. Trusting he wouldn't betray my confidence, I told the tale of how I landed up in Montana. He returned with his own stories. After graduating from high school, he had married immediately only to find his ex-wife sleeping with another man. Driven by a flash of wrath, he had almost killed the man, earning a 5-year prison term. Bill spent the last 30 years here, and upon his release he was the only one ready to give him an opportunity. Sam said great things about Bill and Colleen, thinking of them as the salt of the earth. Half an hour later we arrived at the fence delineating the property limits. Sam saw that just about every third one of the posts required replacing. Not all of them had rotted or were near to each other. He stayed with me to make sure I was doing it right as I swapped the first 2. He advised working till about 4 o'clock so that I could make it to supper at 6 o'clock, have enough time to return, take care of the horse and mules. To make sure I wouldn't get lost, his parting words were to follow the stream back down. He turned around and left me by myself working. I moved along the line substituting fresh posts for old ones. I stopped at midday and pulled from my saddlebag the pork chop sandwiches Colleen had handed me in the morning. I ate my sandwiches then went back to work. The alert of my watch beeped at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I realized I had set all but a few of the posts the mules had carried up. Leading the mules, I followed the fence line back to locate the brook and started down. I came upon a natural pool with streams in and out just before leaving the woods. Stopped to take in the scenery. I knew it was the most peaceful and lovely place on the property. I managed to unsaddle the animals and feed them in time back at the barn. Sam came to bed down his horse as I was caring for the others. Before dinner, when we savored steaks, we hurried to change and clean up. That evening, tired, I participated little in the discussion and excused myself right after dinner to go to bed. I went fast to sleep and slept deeply. I hurt all over when I woke up. My arms, shoulders, and legs throbbed. My hands hurt from running the post hole digger. Even with my consistent exercise, a 2-hour gym session and a full day of fence post installation differs greatly. Bill and Sam laughed as I hobbled into the kitchen and groaned when I sat down. Colleen too couldn't really disguise her smile. Still, even with the pain, I was starving and ate my meal quickly. Ready for still another fencing day? As we stood from the table, Bill inquired. I moaned and answered, "Yes, sir," trying to project more hope than I felt. Bill laughed. "I suppose you could rest it today. You should ride the rounds with Sam." I nodded with gratitude. Cleaning the stalls and swapping the hay came first. We loaded up in the pickup after placing the horses and mules in the pasture and filling their feeder and started our ranch tour. Our main objective was to make sure no calves were split off from their mothers or cows were down. Sam seemed to have natural knowledge of the ranch. He could almost predict where the animals would be and approximated their count. 30 years later, it seemed to come easily to him. Sam halted the truck as we arrived at the far end of the ranch and looked about. He turned to look at something on one of the hills and handed me his binoculars, pointing to a certain area. A minute later I found 2 calves apparently alone. "Where are their mothers?" I asked. He waved toward 2 cows close to the tree line. "That is them across from each other. Their calves have to have walked into the forest, been disoriented and persisted on. We will have to pull them down." "Are we hiking up there?" I asked. Sam shot back. "Nah, it's too far. We'll go back and load a couple of horses." Sam called Bill, telling him of what we had observed and that we were on our way to fetch the horses. The pickups had 2-way radios. Bill saddled 2 horses and loaded them into a trailer when we got back to the stable. All we needed to do was stock up and head off. Sam guided us along the tree line below the calf location, and we unloaded the horses. Sam knew the area like the back of his hand, so riding up into the hills his 30 years on the ranch became clear once more. We eased down behind the calves half an hour later and started gently pushing them back down the hills. When we cleared the trees and the errant young discovered their mothers, I couldn't help but giggle. Running wailing to their mothers, they went straight to grab a teat to suckle. The bigger cows waited patiently so their young can eat. It seemed so different from my early years. Supper that evening was mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, and fried chicken. Driven now, I spoke more than I had the night before and grew to know Colleen. She was 5 years old when her parents came to the United States from Ireland. Fascinated by stories of the Old West, her father had brought the family to Montana and explained the trace of an Irish brogue in her speech. Much better the following day, I went back to repair the fence posts after breakfast. Sam loaded the mules for me, but this time I left on my own. Following the stream got me to where I needed to be. This day turned out to be less difficult than the first since I had some techniques to reduce the effort of the work. I published the last one just before 4 o'clock and returned to the barn. I worked some of the booths with extra time before tidying for supper. On my 4th day I helped Sam do some building repairs. I set more fence posts the next day. 2 months passed quickly, and I now rode the property to see the livestock. I was in the most physical form of my life. Sam took Saturdays off, Bill took off Sundays, and Mondays were my days off. We set a calendar. I ran to town if necessary and used my day doing laundry. Everyone on the property had come somewhat dear to me. Sam was laid back and kind. We used to often sit and chat after dinner. We got along great and I really respected Bill since he was honest and diligent. Though I could sense Colleen had some fire in her, she was quite lovely to Sam and me. She and Bill were a wonderful couple taken all together. Colleen and Bill were becoming really enthusiastic. Colleen told me during Friday breakfast that her daughter would be home in 1 week. That day it was my turn riding a horse throughout the forest, looking for cattle that might have strayed into the hills. About 4 o'clock, I headed to the creek, turned to follow it down, and arrived at the pool below the waterfall. I stopped, got off, removed my shirt and knelt down to the water to dip my bandana into the cool stream. I started clearing the dust and sweat from my neck and cheeks. A whinny from downstream drew my eye and I turned to find a horse and rider heading right. I first assumed it was Colleen, but I soon understood this was a younger rendition of her. With her identical crystal blue eyes and red hair like her mother, this stunning woman could only be Caitlin. Riding up, she halted several feet from me. She asked in a chilly voice, "Who are you and what are you doing on this property?" As I got up and faced her. "Saying the name's Carson, and I work here." "I don't believe you," she said. My dad explained he couldn't afford to pay another hand. I was becoming a little annoyed at her hostile attitude even with her beauty. I said, "Yeah, I overheard that too. That's probably why I chuckle all the way to the bank each paycheck." She looked at me, whirled her horse around, and gave it a sidekick. I laughed to myself, pulled my shirt back on, remounted my horse and headed toward the barn. I later learned that Caitlin's parents had misinterpreted one another. She had arrived a few hours after I had gone out, much to their surprise. They assumed she was returning home the next week. She had spent the morning and early afternoon with her parents until she said she wanted to ride, something she liked to do but had not had time for at school. She hitched up then and rode to her preferred location, the pool and waterfall. I suppose after 2 months I was old news, and Bill and Colleen had omitted to mention me. I saw the rear of the redhead vanish inside as I made back off to the barn. I got off and started to walk my horse inside. Caitlin had been searching for her father when at last she came upon him in the barn. As she inquired, "Who is that man that was up at the waterfall?" I could plainly hear her strong voice. For a moment Bill considered and remarked, "That must have been Carson. He said he works here, but last time I was here you told me you couldn't afford to pay another hand," she remarked. "Well, he is right, he does work here," Bill said. "Regarding his pay, I doubt that is of relevance for your company." "Young woman, I still run this ranch," she choked. "But he said you pay him so much that he laughs all the way to the bank." I had wandered into the barn by then. She didn't notice me, she turned her back on me. Bill did. Grinning broadly, he replied, "Is that true, Carson? Should you believe you're overpaying, I can correct that." She whirled around, locking me in her look. "Well, I would hate to take advantage of you, Bill." I pulled my hat off with one hand and rubbed the back of my head with the other. "Just how much do you intend to lower my pay?" Bill and I started crying laughing at that. She simply kept glaring at both of us, not seeing the joke. "Sweetheart, just so you get that bee out of your bonnet, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next Sam's," Bill remarked. She followed with, "And what else?" "That, and he gets to eat your mother's fine cooking," Bill said. She persisted. "So you're claiming you aren't paying him? Why would he labor for no result?" "He has his reasons, it's not my place to tell you," Bill answered. Then I contributed. "Working to have a chance to taste your mother's cooking is worth a lot, and I don't think she would like to hear you say that it's nothing." She glowed one more at me and bolted from the barn. Shaking his head, Bill added, "She reminds me so much of her mother when she was young." I never imagined I would be carrying Colleen to dinner that evening. Caitlin followed us. She threw me another stinging glance when I walked into the kitchen, seated opposite Sam on the other side of the table. I held out until everyone had loaded their plates before talking. "Your mother tells me you have finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine," I added in a friendly way. Her one-word response, offered without looking up, was, "Yeah." I went on. "Sam says he's nearly 30 miles away and that there is only one other vet in the vicinity. I have no doubt that you will be quite helpful to the people living here." She looked up at my comment and I assumed her eyes softened a little. "Certainly, that would be Dr. Harrison. He is often needed in more than one location at once and has more business than he can manage." Then Colleen said, "I agree with you, Carson. Our Caitlin will deliver a first-rate performance." Throughout the rest of the dinner, Caitlin spoke with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch since before she was born. She avoided direct contact with me and I often kept silent. This was her homecoming, and I knew Sam's parents wanted to know what had been happening in her life while she was overseas. I hurried away to turn in as soon as I finished eating. When I got back to my cabin, I looked through my email and found one from Jake. He claimed to have casually asked a friend of his on the police force whether they still regarded me as a missing person. Everything had been dropped, his friend stated, after they got the email including the photo I had provided them. Regarding Janice, Brandon had evidently thrown her as soon as he saw I had vanished with all the money, and it seemed unlikely Janice would be able to get her hands on any of it soon. She was working as a waitress in a city apartment, obviously unable to afford the rent on the property we had been living in. She lacked the funds to get a lawyer to follow after me. She had evidently only married me for my money, and her boyfriend had only desired her for the same reason. My money. I considered it humorous. Though I now only did it every third or fourth day, I was still building fence posts. I had left the hills and was down where I could drive the pickup to where I worked. Loading the posts in the truck's rear rather than on the mules made sense. The morning Caitlin got home, I filled the pickup with posts and drove to where I had left off. I walked to the truck during my regular lunch break and discovered I had forgotten my meal. Colleen would make sure we had lunch if any of us were working far from the main home all day. I suppose I spaced out picking mine. Although I could have driven back to the house, I figured missing one supper would not kill me. Just setting a post about half an hour later, I was attaching the wire when I heard a car approaching. Looking back, I saw among the ranch vehicles one of them. The truck stopped exactly as I was finishing with that post. Turning around, I found Caitlin getting startled. Like the little sacks Colleen packed our lunches in, she carried a little bag. Shoving the sack toward me. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said. "I grabbed it from her out here." "Thanks, Caitlin," I answered. That was rather courteous. As usual, I checked the sack and found 2 sandwiches. She shook her head no as I pulled one out for her. I offered the other. I rolled my shoulders and headed to eat from the truck's tailgate. She strolled over to where I was, roughly 5 feet to the side, and simply gazed at me. I ate with my eyes fixed in front of me. At last she questioned, "Why are you here?" Turning, I gazed at her and decided to play a little with her. "You can't tell anybody. I stashed the money after robbing a bank. I'm hiding here till the heat is off so I can get the cash." Her eyes became wide initially, then she sent me a glare. She sighed, turned to go, saying, "You're a real clown." I waited to contact her until she reached her truck midway. She halted, then turned slowly around. "I wed someone who only wanted the things I could offer her and never loved me. I got up here because I just wanted to temporarily escape what I knew." She fixed another glance at me, and I believe she determined this time I was speaking the truth. She nodded her head and went silent once again. I considered what her dad had said about her mother behaving like that at her age as she drove away. He said he had calmed her, but I thought the key was their love for one another. Less than 24 hours had passed since I first saw Caitlin, and I could not see any man taming that fiery redhead. That evening's dinner was essentially a replay of the evening before. Caitlin talked with Sam and her parents. She didn't know me, hence we had nothing in common, and I didn't feel slighted. Actually, Bill went to answer a knock on the door while we were just completing dinner. He entered the kitchen, then followed by a man my age. Women would have called him tall, black and attractive. With great enthusiasm, Caitlin called his name, leaped from her seat and hugged the person. They were clearly gabbing away about how long it had been since they had seen each other, clearly knowing one another. A few minutes later the door knocked once more. Bill responded once more and came back accompanied by another man, this one fair-haired but also attractive. Caitlin also greeted him quite warmly. I remembered Bill's comments of having to battle off every male nearby to win his wife. At least in appearances, Caitlin was exactly the treasure her mother was. I left the meal excusing myself and went back to my cabin. Mentally, I hoped the two guys' luck was good. Though I did envy them, whoever won her affections would be a lucky man if Caitlin proved to be the woman her mother was. I grabbed the truck the following day and rode the property. Something didn't seem to match by the time I had done my rounds. Early enough, I returned to pick Sam and we had a whirl-around tour of the ranch. Though he agreed that something didn't feel right, it simply appeared like we were lacking a few herds. There were plenty of cows scattered around the ranch. We resolved we would ride the mountainous sections and saddle up the following day. Bill agreed to our scheme when we brought it up at dinner that evening. That night it rained, which would complicate track search. Bill took us to one end of the property after we loaded our horses into a trailer early the next morning. Sam continued another third higher. I rode perhaps 3/3 of the way up into the tree line. We then crossed the ranch across the hills, across the trees. Reaching the far side took up much of the day. There were 5 stray herds counted here. Bill greeted us as we emerged from the hills. We placed the horses into the trailer and proceeded back. We talked about the matter and agreed that our sole action may be increased vigilance. That evening at supper, Caitlin received another call from a suitor. Her mother murmured something about that, the third one she had that day. Word had leaked that she was returning home, and men were crawling out of the timber work looking for her. We kept a close check on the herd for 4 more days. Except for the suspected original loss, everything seemed to be in order. Caitlin's potential mates kept paying visits. She had been home for a week and had not spoken to me 2 words since the day she brought my lunch. On the 5th day following the apparent livestock disappearance, I told Bill I wanted to bike the property line across the hills. We had seen no proof the missing animals had crossed through the grazing regions and we had already covered the fence lines there. Sam dropped me off to the west side of the property, where Bill's bordered Wilson property. I saw 3 new sets of horse tracks crossing from the Wilson side of the fence onto Bill's side around midway to the southwest corner. The odd thing was the fence wire was still up. After dismounting and looking at the fence posts, I discovered that 5 of the staples had been loosened and were hardly keeping the wire upright. Eliminate the staples, lower the wire, and you may cross across. Reverse the wire and staples, and it looked right. I went remounted following the tracks. Approaching the stream, I noticed 3 horses tethered to a tree somewhat above the waterfall. Still roughly 30 yards distant, I rapidly tied my horse to a tree and drew the gun from its sheath. When I arrived at the horses, I discovered boot prints headed downstream. I staggered to the brink of the waterfall, peered over, then gasped. Naked as the day she was born, Caitlin was in the pool. The image captivated me since she swam across the lake, her naked body obviously on show in the pure water. A movement in the trees to her right helped me to come back to reality. I looked fast around and noticed 2 additional men approaching the pond on the left and 1 guy to the right. I lifted my firearm and fired. On the right, the bullet landed close to the guy's feet. 1 more fast trigger pull and the dirt erupted near the left 2 guys. A blood-curdling scream from Caitlin reverberated over the woods. Rising so everyone can see me, I cried, "On your bellies now, I won't be missing the following shot. Stay where you are, Caitlin." She simply saw me standing over her clutching a weapon and battled to hide her body. She hadn't noticed the 3 males. One of the men on the left gasped as if he were about to flee, but as I pressed the trigger once again the bark of the tree next to him burst. Persuaded, he dropped flat down. Looking where I had fired, Caitlin saw the two men shrieking once again. I began to count down. Before I could say one, the other two dropped down too. I told them right away to place their hands behind their heads, and they complied. I asked Caitlin right away to leave and change. She tried to object, but I growled at her to just follow my directions, get ready and go. Clearly terrified, I could see her shivering from where I stood, but she followed my direction. She left the pool like Venus rising out of the sea. She emerged from the sea back away from me, but I couldn't look away from her. Her alabaster skin and the most precisely shaped butt I'd ever seen stayed with me always. She just put on her jeans and blouse, swung up upon her horse and kicked once to be across the woods. I told the men one by one to get up on their knees and then lie back down when she was away. I sighed with relief just when all three were before me. I judged it time for a bluff. What then ought I to do with you three? I could just shoot you in the legs and see you die slowly. The three men started to ask me to spare them. Even if I spare you, I replied, Caitlin's father will guarantee justice when I tell him of your horrible plans regarding his daughter. Unless, of course, you have something like cattle rustling for your confession to the sheriff. Although it can result in jail, at least it gives you a chance at life. The tiniest among them cracked. Indeed, we did it. Wilson said breaking Buckman would guarantee Wilson his land. His friend quieted him to close, but he answered, I ain't dying for no damn cows. Knowing Caitlin would be back quickly and her father would surely investigate, I decided to purchase more time. As expected, 45 minutes later Bill and Sam galloped right front. They motioned me down, then rushed up to meet me at the top of the climb. What in the devil is happening? Bill wanted it. It seems some of Wilson's hands paid us a visit unwelcomely. I followed them here from the fence line. Three were trying to sneak up on Caitlin while she was swimming. I pushed my rifle's barrel up against the smaller man's neck. I believe this one has something he wants to confess to you. Again prodded he whined, we did it. Although we grabbed some of your animals, Wilson drove us. Bill turned his cap back and grinned at Sam. You know, they hung cattle rustlers and horse thieves when my grandfather managed this property. Back then justice sometimes felt easier. Too bad these days we have to be polite. Bill and I decided to march the rustlers back down carrying rifles while Sam stood guard. Sam tethered their horses together and raised the rear, thereby trailing after them. When we arrived at the buildings, we guided the rustlers into the barn and arranged them in individual stalls with open doors that let us monitor without them seeing each other. Bill entered the house to summon the sheriff, Sam and I watching from behind. The sheriff raced the long drive in less than 30 minutes. Bill met him and briefed him on the developing events. He agreed when I suggested first bringing the smaller offender out so the sheriff could question her. I went right outside with my prisoner. First reluctant, the small rustler seemed to think about his quietness and started talking. Looking at Bill, the sheriff remarked, it seems that our case here is simple trespassing. Though I could leave them in your hands, honestly it's a little waste of my time. Ignore me, I will let you manage things. The scared rustler opened suddenly and expanded his eyes. The sheriff called for assistance as he quickly pulled the truth. Not too long later, Wilson's large property was inundated with the sheriff's car convoy. The sheriff found approximately 100 stolen cattle bearing the Rocking Bee brand, even though the area the rustler pointed out was quite large. By day's end Wilson and his friends were behind bars. In among the chaos, it was well past 9 when we sat for dinner. Though seated at the table, Caitlin kept her eyes fixated on her dish. What were you outside doing? Having not had much opportunity to interact with her, Bill asked her directly. I was swimming right now. She flashed me an accusing look, saying, I didn't think anyone would spy on me. I interrupted. First of all, Caitlin, I wasn't watching you. I followed their horse trails across to the stream. Second, think about what may have happened without me. Those three were probably not planning a picnic when they noticed you swimming shirtless. Colleen said, thanks goodness you showed Carson when you did. I shudder to consider what might have happened. Aware of an early start the next day, the discussion changed and we rapidly ate our dinner. Coming out of the kitchen toward my cabin, Caitlin shouted to me. Stopped and waited as she angrily asked, so, did you enjoy the view today? Anticipating thanks proved overly optimistic, so I said, let's just say I'd be dishonest if I claimed it wasn't breathtaking. She sniffed and turned on her heels, striding toward the house. I stood shaking my head, realizing there was something about me that regularly hooked her. Bill had to go into town formally charging Wilson the next day. Returning the pilfers of cattle to their proper area would take several days since the prosecutor had to first completely document the case. Sam and I worked through some of the barns renewing the paint all day. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin declined to join us, A choice that would have been perfectly acceptable. Bill came back early in the afternoon but waited until dinner to report the changes. Wilson and his friends will be released on bond since this wasn't a capital case, he said. Although he expected no more conflict, he advised us to be alert. Looking at his daughter, he grinned cheekily and remarked, "If you're planning on another nude swim anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson along, for protection." Her cheeks was red and she staggered as she stood and hurried to her room. Bill and Sam burst out in laughter, and even Colleen found herself giggling. I laughed at their pace. We started our dinner when the laughs stopped. Bill kept his gentle mocking going. "I truly owe thanks to Carson. Wilson might have financially risked this property rather significantly. You are well worth every penny." We had yet another round of jokes. 3 days later Bill was informed he could have his livestock back. Riding with a sheriff's escort, we loaded 3 horses into a trailer and headed to Wilson's Flying Doll Ranch. Once we had the horses unloaded, Colleen came along to run the truck and trailer back. Starting to drive the cows back toward his ranch, Bill, Sam and I rode ahead and loosened a section of the fence line as we neared the Rocking Bee Ranch so the cattle could pass over. Content with the day's work, we tightened the fencing and rode back to the main house after making sure every cow was back where it belonged. Caitlin had filed for her veterinarian license during this period. She could only tend to the animals on her father's property for now, while the approval procedure usually took 45 days. I would find her all around the place and, naturally, at mealtimes. If I could catch her eye, despite her silent treatment, I would grin broadly and wriggle my eyebrows, always enough to make her flush. 2 weeks following the waterfall incident, we discovered ourselves in the barn at the same time. "Been enjoying any swims lately?" I asked. She walked up, inches apart, and glowed at me. "Why are you such a **** hole?" I shrugged, laughed and asked, "Why are you such a B**********?" Her right hand sought my face, but I moved quickly to seize her wrist before she could hit. Still undeterred, she attempted with her left and I caught that too. Pushing both hands behind her back, I pinned her and drove her body against mine. I dropped my face slowly near hers. She gazed at me but did not try to break away. "If you were mine, I'd put you over my knee and spank your butt," I remarked then. Pulling back, she said, "You wouldn't dare." I let off suddenly, and she dropped backward crashing on her butt. I just got rid of one woman who doesn't care about me. I'm not wasting my time on another. I wouldn't dare. She was the one who used to storm off first, but this time it was my turn. I walked out of the barn, leaving her on the ground. I saw her just before dinner. She avoided me predictably, but I couldn't interpret the look she gave me. Not that I ever claimed to know women anyhow. That proved true in my marriage to Janice. The next day I was in the barn looking over the stalls when Bill entered. Knowing Sunday was his day off, I reasoned he wanted to chat. I questioned whether Caitlin had told him about the incident from the previous day and whether he had come to urge me to leave. As he neared, I stopped working. "I heard you and Caitlin had a little showdown yesterday," he stated then. That addressed my concern about whether Caitlin had told her father, but I sensed a glitter in his eyes. "Sure, you might say that," I replied. "Most likely my fault." He went on. "Maybe, maybe not. Her problem, in my opinion, is her uncertainty of what to regard you. She considered you to be here for something first, then you turned into the hero saving the ranch and her. Why you aren't following after her like the other local young men is something she finds incomprehensible. Like her mother at her age, Caitlin is accustomed to having men encircling her little finger. She has had a couple of boyfriends, but none stayed. She hardly seemed to respect them. Simply said, 'I hope you don't let her chase you off. In my book, you are welcome here as long as you wish.' I answered, 'Thanks, Bill, that means a lot to me. I'll stop taunting Caitlin, hopefully allowing us to live and let live.' He left the barn and I started working again. I thought about Bill's comments throughout the rest of the day. Acting respectfully and having a discourse would be more successful than Caitlin's present method in helping her to understand me. Regarding her like the others, that simply wasn't in the cards. She skipped dinner that evening, a subject no one brought up, and I asked nothing. Even on my day off, I followed my schedule the next day, getting up at 5 as normal. Breakfast done. After Sam and Bill left for work, I got my washing. Bill had made significant investments in a big industrial washer and dryer, allowing me to run one load of all of my clothes. Since the laundry room was next to the kitchen, I stayed at the kitchen table eating and talking with Colleen while my clothes washed. Usually choosing to eat later, Caitlin entered, an unusual event for breakfast. Colleen inquired about my daily agenda and I mentioned I was considering traveling into town. I then inquired whether she wanted anything specifically for me to pick up. She mentioned that, should I be so inclined, there were a few items I could acquire for her. I guaranteed her I wouldn't mind at all. Caitlin interrupted at that. Cool, I'll bike into town with you. It seems like a waste of petrol for both of us to go separately. I had intended to go to the local shop for a few things. Surprised, I turned to say, sure, I would be happy to give you a lift. After yesterday, I hadn't expected her to approach me, let alone ask to travel anywhere with me. I'll be leaving in about an hour and a half, after my laundry is done and put away, I said. She said she would be ready. She sat at the table, silent as Colleen and I carried on our talk after finishing cooking something to eat. Later when I left my cabin, she came out from the rear door looking gorgeous in a turquoise sundress that matched her red hair. She clearly wanted for me to see her. Keeping the passenger side door open for her, I saw her slide inside the car. We started off, and she watched the countryside silently for half of the journey. She said suddenly, I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday. I looked at her, but she appeared to be staring out the side window and her face eluded me. So I answered, well, while that may not have been unpleasant, I do have a rule about not forcing unwanted affections upon unreceptive females. Her head whirled around out of the corner of my vision, and I knew she was staring at me. She sat silently, but I detected sporadic looks in my direction. We turned around and entered the general store. She had a list of things her mother wanted and I had to pick some fresh pairs of pants and blouses. An hour later we got everything loaded. Lunchtime arrived, and I was hungry. I had one more visit at the hardware shop for a few things for Bill. She agreed when I advised we stop for a bite to eat. We drove into the same diner where Bill and Colleen had first met. We ordered our food and set a table across from one another. Sitting in quiet, I started to consider maybe I should have gone directly to the hardware store and then back to the ranch. The door swung open just then, 3 men walking in. 2 of them were the guys who had come knocking on Caitlin. They rushed for our table, the third stood behind me while 2 took seats on either side. They started chatting to her and ignored me. Rising from my seat, I pointed for the third one to settle in as I proceeded to the next table. I motioned the waitress over to have her place our lunch in front of me when she delivered it. I ate fast, without looking at the conversation happening at Caitlin's table. Rising to cover our supper from some bills on the table, her plate was still full and Caitlin had hardly eaten her dinner. I am going to dash to the hardware store. Later on, I can stop back here to see whether you're ready to go, I remarked, stepping in to interrupt their talk. She shoved her plate back, got up and said, it was nice seeing you guys again, but we have to go. The men seated at the table tried to object. One even volunteered to drive home. She turned away and trailed me to my SUV. She stayed in the car looking to be fuming as we drove to the hardware store. The quiet suspense followed us back to the ranch. She exclaimed, why did you do that? Turning off the highway down the mile-long driveway. What? I said, not sure what she was pointing out. Reading to the other table, she said. Oh, it is interesting. I assumed then that you would rather hang out with your buddies. Besides, I wanted not to be in the thick of their vying for your attention. She snapped, you really are a *****. I kept my mouth closed wisely. I had no desire to fight her slaps while behind the wheel. She pulled up to the main home and collected what she could carry right away as soon as I opened the SUV's back. I carried extra bags and trailed her inside the house. She threw everything on the kitchen table without saying anything to her mother as I stepped in the rear door, then walked off toward her room. Colleen turned to ask a dubious question. I said, I guess I'm in a ***** hole, shrugging. She laughed and moved up to lay a hand on my arm. I have never seen someone affect Caitlin the way you seem to have. I responded, I guess I was born to just piss her off. She left me wondering when she said, I'm not so sure about that. I went back to my cabin and tucked up my fresh wardrobe. Choosing to get out from under confinement, I saddled a horse in the barn. I ended up sitting at the top of the waterfall sitting out. The weather was good, so I tied the horse to a tree and sat at the fall's edge staring down the still pool. Caitlin rode up below me, getting off her horse, half an hour or maybe longer seated there. Not wanting to be accused of spying in case she was skinny dipping once more, I grabbed a stone and threw it down to produce a splash in the water. She turned around looking for the noise source and saw me. She expected to be leaving, but instead mounted her horse and galloped up to where I was seated. Was walking toward me from her horse, which was hitched beside mine. Rising, I moved away from the brink in case she intended to shove me off. Stopped inches from me, she said, you're a ***** hole. And you're still a B************, I said. I skipped waiting for her slap this time. I held her about the waist and kissed her, releasing her fast. She grabbed my arm and turned me back around even as I tried to approach my horse. When she grabbed behind my neck and drew me in for another kiss, I was astounded. We discovered ourselves in an enthusiastic hug. Our clothing vanished and we had a great time as the enthusiasm developed. Our breathing settled gradually, and we stayed in a quiet embrace. We groomed, mounted our horses, and rode back. She turned and headed to the main house after stealing our mount silently. I went back to my cabin in a haze and slid into the shower. One thing became very clear: I felt far more for this fascinating woman than I had admitted to myself. I hardly had time to get dressed for dinner. Bill, Colleen, Sam were already in the kitchen when they arrived, but Caitlin was nowhere to be seen. She came in as we were seated and chose the chair next to mine instead of her normal spot near Sam. Bill and Colleen looked at one another, and Caitlin just grinned politely. She animatedly spoke during dinner. Though curious, her parents avoided questioning why their daughter was in such great spirits. She helped her mother tidy the kitchen after dinner while Sam and I returned to our cabins. Just as I had snuggled between the sheets, my door knocked softly. Wearing just my boxers, I unlocked the door and Caitlin slid inside, toward my arms. We kissed tenderly, and she led me back to my bed following her clothes shedding. Once more, we made love before nodding out into each other's embrace. The sudden arrival of 5 a.m. made me groggy, reach over and turn off the screaming alarm. I forced myself from bed with tremendous reluctance. I left a soft kiss on her head, then lit the bathroom and got ready for the day before sliding out of the cabin. I couldn't ignore Bill and Colleen's careful looks during breakfast. I asked whether they knew where their daughter disappeared to at night. I loaded the pickup after the dinner so I could install fence posts another day. Working on a ranch by yourself gave lots of time for reflection. My thoughts turned to my recent past. Amazed that only 3 months had passed since divorcing my wife, it seemed like a lifetime. I thought about the meaning Bill, Colleen, and Sam had in my life. Then my thoughts turned to the lovely Caitlin and the shared events from yesterday. I thought about the kind of love her parents embodied. I found once more at lunch that I had neglected to pack my lunch. The idea came to me and I heard a pickup racing toward me. Caitlin shot out, sprinting toward me with a bag. She launched herself at me, planted a passionate kiss, then handed me the bag. Ignoring the supper, I drew her in for another passionate kiss. I set my post to her a few times even though I didn't mark as many fence posts that day. We also found time to converse throughout our passionate times. I shared specifics of my past life, including how my ex-wife had betrayed me. I told her, "The only way I will leave is if you tell me to go." She came home at last, and I completed today's tasks. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, having a shower and changing, once more selecting the seat next to mine. A knock at the front door mid-meal was heard. Bill responded and came back carrying the same man who had first called on Caitlin. Caitlin gazed at him, her face unreadable, the minute he was seated. "I was wondering if you might want to go for a drive," he asked. Driving was practically a euphemism for going on a date in this section of the nation where choices were few. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think my boyfriend would like it," Caitlin said. She slanted over to kiss my cheek. Blushed and flustered, Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome hurried out. That conversation let our friendship be seen clearly. Looking at Bill and Colleen, I saw approving smiles. Bill wore a huge smile. We had formally become a couple. Local males calling on Caitlin stopped paying visits in the next few days. She made it abundantly apparent she was not accessible. I figured out how I might help her with her ideas. She was looking for a loan from the bank to buy the tools her veterinary company needed. The only choice was to have her father list the ranch as collateral. The bank was reluctant to grant an unsecured loan. She was not sure she should ask him. "I recommend a few days. I might have an answer." I opened an account under the pretense of a fictional loan company by calling my offshore bank. On my computer, Caitlin completed a loan application that I had configured to direct to my email. 2 days later, I informed her loan had been approved and a wire transfer would be delivered to her account. The news delighted her, but she wondered why the loan only carried a 2% annual rate. They were a non-profit charitable group lending money to people they thought would benefit the community, I said. I knew she was too proud to take the money, even if I could have just given her it. Having acquired her degree by diligence, she was resolved to achieve on her own terms. She had bought a new van, turned into a mobile veterinarian office with all the required tools by the time her license was issued. Local ranchers called for her services as word of her license status got out. Many evenings Caitlin stayed in my cabin with me. Bill and Colleen seemed to have no objections even though they knew. She was old enough at 27 to be making her own decisions. Wilson and his team faced trial 3 months later. The case was really simple. The smallest man cooperated with the prosecutors, getting 2 years of probation instead of jail. Each of the 5 other hands Wilson hired received 5 years in prison. Wilson, the brains behind the rustle, was sentenced to 10 years and fined $50,000. I looked into him and his ranch when he was sent to jail. There was no one left to handle the ranch when he found he was single with no family in the vicinity and with all his hands imprisoned. This let me create a fresh strategy. But before I started it, I had to conclude my divorce, some unresolved stuff. It was unacceptable to me to consider Janice having half my money. I sought help once more from my friend Jake to reach this. I requested him to speak with Janice instead of writing an email, so phoning him I wanted him to say that I had gotten in touch and wanted to provide a settlement in exchange for a divorce. The offer was just $50,000. She would never hear from me once she turned down and would not get paid either. Playing innocent at first, she insisted on knowing why I'd left and why I would not be coming back. The act came apart when Jake came clean about her romance with Brandon and her intention to divorce me. Janice accepted my offer when her game was revealed. She is still a waitress and suffers financially. I had to go back to Texas and get a lawyer to draft the divorce paperwork before moving forward. When I told Caitlin of my leaving, she was not happy. I told her I would be back and stated I had to shut that chapter of my life. She insisted on taking me and being there upon my return. Even though at first I intended to leave my car in long-term parking at the airport. Leaving behind my SUV and most of my stuff, except for what would fit in one suitcase, seemed to help her relax. On a Sunday, I left and Jake picked me up at the airport. Making sure to call Caitlin every night, I stayed with his family. Friday saw all the paperwork arranged. Explaining that Janice would get a check for $10,000 right away and that the rest $40,000 would be paid in 60 days following the divorce, Jake brought Janice to my lawyer. She signed the paperwork, and my attorney handed her the $10,000 payment. Never had to deal with Janice. Then I realized I had personal stuff in storage. Yearbooks, souvenirs and antiques from my parents, and other precious objects. Wanting not to go back for them later, I hired a moving van and loaded it. When I told Caitlin I wasn't flying back, she was first surprised, but her enthusiasm about my homecoming rose as I explained I was bringing back everything significant to her. To get the distance covered, I drove nonstop for 3 days. Everyone greeted me enthusiastically as I arrived Tuesday night at the Rockinby Ranch. Caitlin kept extending her friendly welcome till early dawn, when we at last nodded off, completely worn out. My first half of the strategy was finished. Now I was ready to apply the rest. This included many visits to the jail where Wilson was housed. I wanted him to sell me his property. At first hostile, I kept arguing my case. He would be imprisoned for at least 7 years, I noted, and even with good behavior, he would not be eligible for release. Without someone to look after his ranch, his house and structures would probably fall apart, and his animals would probably die over the winter without appropriate care. I also wondered whether he would be welcomed back following his conviction. When the prospect of ruin presented itself, he finally took my offer and had something to start over with when released. Securing funding came next. Knowing Janice wouldn't compromise her $40,000 by acting rashly, I moved my money back into the country. It was really simple to get financing as I negotiated a $5 million price with Wilson that was less than the actual value of the property. I financed the $500,000 down payment I made. Spending a month finishing everything, I kept my activities under wraps except for Caitlin and Bill. I told them I needed to give my assets some personal business-related attention. I established a corporation and registered the land under its name even though I only spent 1 or 2 days a week on it. I hired someone to cut the hay on the land as summer was closing and fall was setting in. In the meanwhile, I also used 4 hands to run the ranch and live on site. Appointed as temporary foreman, the most experienced hand explained that, albeit being close, I would be an absentee owner for a while. I promised him he could always reach me by phone, and I scheduled regular trips to the property. The last component of my strategy was renovating the main house, a 2-story 5-bedroom property requiring modernizing. Even if Caitlin was annoyed with my hiding of my activities, our connection kept flourishing. Every day my love for her deepened and I sensed she felt the same about me. Her veterinary practice grew rapidly and she had to be on the road often, yet she was comfortable and joyful. It got to the point where I almost told her about what I was doing, almost leaking the beans. She cornered me with questions after coming back to check on the remodeling. "What the devil is Carson doing? You see someone else?" "God, no," I said, "I swear there is no one else. I simply have certain tasks I have to finish. Please believe me, I will shortly tell you everything. Please start to believe me." "Okay Carson, I do trust you, but you better tell me what's going on soon, or I'm going to kick your ass," she added, examining my face in quest of the truth. I grabbed her and planted all the love I could on a kiss. The main house renovation was finished as spring started and calving season got underway. It was time to carry out the last element of my scheme. I invited Caitlin to drive one afternoon while she was alone herself. I have been considering it time for me to leave the Rocking Bee Ranch, I told her. Her eyes filled with tears instantly, then she continued, but I promised I wouldn't leave. I had timed it to coincide with our arrival to the former Flying Doll Ranch's gate. I turned in and was going down the private road. I wasn't particularly intending to travel far, I said. She turned to glance about, obviously perplexed. I'm not sure she listened to what I said. She then inquired as to our activities on Wilson's territory. I put off responding until we arrived at the main home. I told her to come on so I could show her something. Out of the truck, I walked around opening her door. I took her hand and walked her to the front door, opening it. What the heck are we doing? She said once again. For this we might run afoul of rules. I advised her to unwind, that Wilson no longer owns the ranch, and that we should look about. I wanted to find out her opinion of the house. We walked through the bedrooms upstairs, then returned downstairs. The living room was spacious, the den was elegantly paneled, 2 rooms set up as home offices, and last but not least the kitchen. Her look told me she was delighted at the new kitchen. The one room with furniture was the one I meant to use for my office. The rest of the house waited for her choices about its furnishings. When I asked her what she thought of the house, she replied it was rather lovely. When I then questioned whether she felt she could live there, she exclaimed, "What the hell is going on?" She was clearly perplexed and growing agitated. I lowered to one knee and reached into my jacket pocket with a hand. I told Wilson I did and that she could live on the ranch as my wife. Wilson no longer owned it. She answered in an unexpected tone, "You own the house." I nodded furiously, and she said, "Yes." I then pulled the engagement ring from my pocket, held it up and asked her to marry me. Her face wrinkled and tears flooded her eyes. I first assumed I had made a mistake till she tackled me into my back and planted lips over my face. She then held her finger so I could slide the ring on. She then turned about the house with fresh eyes, running from room to room and closely looking at everything. I waited calmly till she returned sprinting back into my arms. She exclaimed fervently, "The house is beautiful, I love it." She followed me across the room to 2 doors opening off a hall. I added, "There are 2 offices, one for you to run your business from and one for me," receiving yet another long kiss. After guiding her into the office with the desk, I brought out a big sheet of paper. Its sketch had a property gate bearing the name C Ranch above it. Examining it closely, she wondered what the C meant. "It stands for Carson and Caitlin Ranch," I told her. I joined her, stripping her off when she started tugging at my clothes. She was crying. I set her atop the desk, and together we christened the office with our love. We made love in every room of our new house in the next few days. It was time to go tell her parents, once we had recovered and changed clothes. I believe she floated out to the truck, clearly delighted. A few minutes after 6 we returned and Bill, Colleen and Sam were already in the kitchen having dinner. Walking in together, Caitlin waved her left hand and shrieked, "We're getting married!" Bill and Sam came over, pumped my hand and patted me on the back while Colleen got up and ran over to hug her daughter. Then Caitlin hugged her father and Sam, and my future mother-in-law gave me a huge hug. Once things cooled off, we all sat down to eat. Caitlin waited till everyone finished their meals. "Of course, this means we will be moving," she remarked as apathetically as could be. Bill, Colleen, and Sam said simultaneously, "What?" I answered, "Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours?" She pressed me to inform them. I reasoned it might be a benefit. Standing angrily, Bill shouted, "There's no way in hell the Flying Doll is going to get his ranch." Laughing, I advised him to cool off. "It's no more the Flying Doll but the C Ranch, the new owners are seated at your table right now." Confused, he asked me what I was referring to. "I bought out Wilson, now, C, Carson and Caitlin own the ranch," I said. Colleen realized it immediately. Bill sat down, turned to face Colleen, and she nodded her head. We shook on his hand he held across the table to me. "Damn it, Carson, I accept your offer although this will take some getting used to." I answered, "This implies Sam will be the head foreman since we will have more hands to monitor. And now I get to remove all those fence posts I labored so hard to install on that side of the property." Everyone laughed. That evening was a noisy party. Caitlin wore me out and slept at my cabin overnight. The next morning we arrived late for breakfast, yet everyone was still in the kitchen when we arrived. They were waiting for us to eat so that Caitlin might show off our new house and we could all go over to the C Ranch. Everyone was amazed. I watched Colleen glare angrily at the rebuilt kitchen. Caitlin and her mother spent a month furnishing the house. On our wedding night, it was ready to move into. We married on the C Ranch. Respected and well-liked, Bill and his family invited ranchers and their families from miles around to mark the occasion. I was invited into Caitlin's life as her husband, Bill's son-in-law, and new Double C Ranch owner. We at last got to bed later that evening and stayed there, having love all evening and most of the next day. We would still be there, but on our third day of marriage I brought her to Fiji for a tropical honeymoon. Our first roundup that year turned out nicely, and we sold a lot of cattle for a good profit. A good amount went into loan payoff, but Caitlin's company was allowing us to live comfortably. We even built Sam a wonderful new house, and he now lives in town with an age-appropriate partner. We might be having another wedding very soon. Another year has passed, and my lovely wife recently delivered the most amazing news: she is pregnant. We are going to be parents. One last note before I leave. I know some who would argue I should have signed a prenuptial agreement and paid my lesson the first time. If so, you really have not come to know my Caitlin. She isn't Janice. She takes care of our house and gives her job great effort. She is the daughter of her mother and loves me daily with just me. Every day peering into her blue Irish eyes I find love.